I do have a question here, Dr. Gill, if I may. In one of the things you mentioned about the All India framework, in it doesn't work. It's something to the effect you said that. Do you care elaborating on that? Because my understanding to that is coming from my criminal justice academic background. I understand that something to do with centralization and decentralization. When you say that All India framework doesn't work, I'm thinking of it that how the centralization of the power in a country as diverse as India, it just cannot work. So is my understanding correct, or do you have a different perspective on your statement in this reference of the farm laws? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think maybe I could have clarified that there's sort of two levels to it, right? I think that the All India framework and the kind of centralization project is part of the BJP's agenda. This is part of their Hindutva plan, right?
Right.
Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, right?
Right.
One language, one religion, one country, and centralizing power in Delhi and reducing the autonomy of states and oppressing minorities and this sort of homogenizing tendency. That much is clear. And I think that is a project actually as part of the Congress as well. This is an old sort of, centralizing of India. And that's why I think, by the way, these bills are actually a violation of the Constitution for those who believe in it, that they're actually violating their own sort of rules because agriculture is supposed to be a state subject, and yet these sort of circumvent that and again, control and centralize power in Delhi. What I was trying to say, though, at another level with the All India issue is that more in terms of analysis, more in terms of the heuristics we use to try to understand social phenomena. We just sort of casually say India, 1.3 billion people, 20, 30 major languages, vast diversity. And what happens is a few sort of examples and places end up standing in for the whole. And that's why I said this sort of Ganga Yamuna, area and this sort of Hindi belt speaking area becomes indicative of the rest of the country. And that's where, and then by the same token, sort of Brahminical Hinduism. Brahminical Hinduism sort of is what is the entirety of the problem. And that's why I'm trying to say that in Punjab, it's different. I would say it's worse because it's not Brahmanism. You kind of know what Brahmanism is, exactly. It's actually mutated and it's changed and it's infiltrated Islam and Sikhi and Christianity. It's taken on different characteristics. It's become part of the social fabric in these different ways. And we actually have to confront those differences if we want to defeat caste in these different contexts. So there's a kind of political struggle with the centralization of power, but just about how we think of historical processes like caste, we need to kind of open up these categories.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Sujata. She's raised her hand, and after that it will be Ms. Meena. Just to give a heads up. Sujata, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Thank you. Jai Bhim, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gill. My question for you is, could you shed some context in terms of the disproportionate, I wouldn't call it focus, but the disproportionate space, a lot of which is legitimate in terms of Punjab and Punjabi farmers leading this movement, both from a historical as well as output point of view, even though, the rest of the country is also affected by these laws. And, the geopolitics of Delhi kind of being concentrated, with the north and proximity to Punjab. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Sujata. Thank you very much. Yeah, the sort of disproportionate space taken up by Punjab and the kind of focus on Punjab, I was going to go into this, but I think I've written about it elsewhere. So that disproportionality, if we will, is a feature of how Punjab was structured into the all India economy. The reason why Punjab is figuring so prominently in this protest is because that is the region that is the most at risk from these bills. And that is because these bills are going to dismantle and undermine the MSP and Mandi systems. Those Mandi systems emerged in the 1960s through what became known as the Green Revolution. Remember that after independence, India experienced food shortages. It was importing grain, and it was desperate to increase domestic grain production in order to legitimize itself as an actual country. And they selected Punjab as the place to deploy these new technologies, which were high yield seed varieties, pesticides, fertilizers, and mechanization. And they linked those to monocycles of wheat and rice. But in order to get farmers to adopt these new technologies, they had to create those two infrastructures of MSP and Mandi. And they put those in place in order to get farmers to adopt these technologies, which led to the explosive expansion in crop output. Punjab is 1.5% of the territory of India, and it produced 60 to 70% of the rice and grain that fed this country for 5 decades. Now, what the BJP is trying to do with these laws is dismantle the MSP and Mandi regimes and throw these people into the volatility of the market. So the MSP and Mandi regimes were not in place in the rest of the country, which is why Kisan and Mazdoor unions in the rest of the country have not been as organized and active in opposing them. Right? The stories you hear from Bihar are, the stories you hear in Bihar are that the Mandi system was dismantled in 2006, and it's led to much more poverty for Bihari Kisans. And there's a kind of warning of what will happen to Punjab. So I think that's part of why there's more organization and activity in Punjab. And then, of course, Punjab and Haryana were one state before 1966. And then Western UP and Rajasthan also gets that kind of benefit of MSP and Mandi. And I should add is that there is a difference with Sikhi. And I think Sikhi has inspired and informed people to organize and confront the state. And there's a long history of that as well in Punjab. And that's part of the kind of idioms of everyday life that people are deploying. And they take different directions. We can sort of come to different conclusions about it, but we can't, I think, deny the power of Sikhi in, like I said, inspiring people to confront the state.
I have unmuted myself, but Manish, you have muted yourself. So I assume you were asking me to speak.
Yes.
And
oh my gosh.
Yes. Yes. So just because it was my turn. Thank you, Navyug, for a very, very comprehensive talk. And I agree with a number of things you say. I would say 95%, but there are a few things that I do want to disagree with. So on describing, particularly for non-Punjabis, on describing the culture of Punjab as being not having a ritual hierarchy and not similar prohibitions, I think you've a little bit overplayed some of what you want to say is the difference of Punjab with respect to the rest. And in particular, one thing which struck me, and I completely disagree because it was my shocking experience, that there is no spatial segregation in villages. That is not correct. Every single village in Punjab is divided along the lines of caste. You have the Jat households on one side and you have Dalits on the other. And there's a street going through, and you know, now maybe in some places where houses have grown and there is greater population, the demarcation is less clear in the sense that the houses have, you know, come closer together. But there is certainly the case that there are two different sides of the village, and on one side live Dalits, on the other side the so-called upper caste. And that was my first time I went to a village. It was beyond belief. I could not believe that that's how people live. Going from a urban Ludhiana to the village after I got married. So that, I think, is one have to bear in mind, that in terms of the geography of the village, it's still very important. And this plays out in many other ways. So if in schools, Dalits children are going to the local school, children of the upper castes are going to schools elsewhere. It plays out in many other ways as well. So that's just like one difference I wanted to mark. And I do agree with many other things you said about the lesser intensity of the difficulty. The second, you mark the difference between the economic difference between Kisan and Mazdoor as really one of laborers and farmers. But the very coming into being of ZPSC, Zameen Prapti Sangharsh Committee, is on a slightly different matter, which is about them collectively having to bid for the common land to till it. So that's a different kind of contradiction and a conflict, which potentially is always a simmering conflict, that this common land which belongs to that they by right have a right to own is always being usurped by the upper caste. So it's that relationship of laborer to farmer is already disturbed in this area where common land can be tilled and be farmed by laborers. So the Zameen Prapti Sangharsh Committee has had some success only in some parts of Punjab, obviously Sangrur district and thereabouts, and but I also see that and we know, of course, of horrible events that have happened where in the past, where direct conflicts between Dalits and the upper caste landlords, in them being refused access to this common land. These are very severe conflicts, violent conflicts that have taken place. So now, at this point of time, we can see they're coming together in a kind of utopian future that I imagine, where a new kind of farming model perhaps can come out of the experience of ZPSC, the Zameen Prapti Sangharsh Committee, the small farming and collective farming, which they are doing. So what I see as the potential coming out of this farmers' protest and going forward, that the small landholders amongst the Jats could possibly really unite with the newly acquired owners of land amongst the Dalits, the collective ownership, that caste, there is a real potential for that caste border to break in this way, a different relationship to land, not Dalits working as Mazdoor for Kisans, but themselves being accepted as Kisans and working alongside the smaller Kisans in Punjab. I think is something that can potentially come out. It would be an amazing thing if that succeeds, if that happens in the going back. And I have a question for you now. I mean, there are other comments. I've been talking to the ZPSC leaders in the last few days. This morning I spoke to them, and they came in a group. ZPSC, about 1,600 of them came on the 23rd of Jan to Delhi, and they are still there. The question I have is about the other group, the KMSC, the Kisan-MAZDOOR Sangharsh Committee, which came from Amritsar, who have fallen foul with the main leadership. I mean, the main leadership has named them alongside those people who went to the Red Fort, etc. And I am not really, in my mind, not at all clear what exactly is their role, what is happening there. That with the KM, what is their status? I mean, there were large numbers of people that came. They were more militant in some ways, but there are accusations now that they are sold, they are on the side of the government. I don't know who to believe on this one. Is sitting so far away, but if you have any information about KMSC, I'd be very grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Meena. It's so good that you could join and we get to connect through these sort of digital events. So to your 3 points, I actually am in broad agreement. So on the first point, I think maybe the point to emphasize is the question of severity and degrees. And so I was trying to mark differences of severity, not at all saying there is no segregation, not at all saying there is no tensions or friction. In my experience in Punjab villages, yes, there is a kind of arrangement of space that might have been 50s and 60s, even 70s maybe. But since the Awadis of the villages have grown, they've expanded in all sorts of different ways. and there isn't, again, one maybe has to resort to some of the stereotypes one gets. The anxiety of crossing the shadow of a Dalit. You sometimes hear this in accounts. I hear this and read this in sort of ethnographies of the 50s and 60s and 70s, but you get this in sort of popular culture too, about how terrible it is to cross the shadow of a Brahmin, of a Dalit, and then one has to rush home and bathe. And this is a kind of caricatured story, but there is a kind of anxiety around that I think is not present in Punjab in the same way. And that's what I was trying to mark. And I even sort of say that when talking about culture, it gets kind of messy. I don't know if my phone or my speakers are echoing, but anyway, so it is about severity. It's not, it is as I think we have a sort of commonality on that. The second point, yeah, I think that the Zameen Property Sangharsh Committee's model of small scale collective cultivation is not just a kind of resistance and protection gesture, but it actually could be something that is put forward and taken up by the half-acre, 1 acre, 2 acre jet, Kisan, because that is the way forward. That the small-scale the small landowner is actually suffering and faces the prospect of landlessness on the horizon. Costs of inputs are going up. Keeping expensive equipment is always, difficult, and the future is landlessness. So they actually have to kind of come up with a different model, and the one they put forward of groups of people cultivating large tracts of land together for a common share of the produce absolutely is viable and could be a model for others to adopt. Part of the challenge is, breaking through the caste bigotry to see a kind of class solidarity. And even saying that sounds kind of mechanical, and we don't want to reduce it to these things, because I'm the one insisting that they're intertwined and it's so messy. But it is getting out of the mindset of asi jimidara, asi alagi rakhna, we're landowners and we're part of sort of difference and we can't align with these people, and seeing the commonality of those interests. So yeah, I'm hopeful for that. The Kisan-Mazdoor Sangharsh Committee, yeah, and Pandey and Pannu, look, I like you, I've probably read and listened to a lot and talked to a bunch of people. I think it's tough to do things in a kind of public forum, but I think there's differences between Deep Sidhu, there's differences with Lakha Sadana, and there's differences with the Kisan-Mazdoor Sangharsh Committee, and there's differences with the Students for Society group. And they kind of have now been sort of lumped in together, and there's particular ire at the first. But I think that this union has membership. As you say, they are sort of considered more militant, more aggressive. And the position they had about not taking the revised route, there's something to that, because the point of a protest is to push the agenda and increase pressure. Now, on the other side, the Sanyukt Kisan Morcha unions that had agreed to the alternative route said very valid arguments about we don't want to jeopardize the whole thing over which gully we're going to cross, and there is credible value of sticking to these routes. And so there was a kind of breakdown. And on the one hand, it's unfortunate, but I remember when this struggle started, there was lots of people that were non-Punjabi and even Punjabi were saying, why do you have 32 unions? How come there's no ekta? Why can't there just be one union? And I was sort of at pains to say, look, sure, we might all like everybody to, join one union, but there are sectional interests, there are class interests, there's political affiliations, and there's a kind of democracy to Punjabi society that gives people the kind of license to have these differences. And so that's part of a mass movement. So for this group, I think that they've shown contrition. They have had a different position from the beginning. They were the last ones to lift the agitation on the rails back in October. And I think that some of their members pushed ahead, and there was a sort of conflation of events. But I think that Pandey's, at least his statements, he is quite regretful. And I think their objective was not to go to the Lal Killa. But this is part of, I guess, how things play out in these kinds of movements. Maybe we can sort of talk afterwards, and I'd like to hear your reading of this same situation.
Thank you. Next, we have Soma Sundaram. And my only request in the interest of time is if we can keep our questions brief, so Dr. Gill has more time to answer, and we can also get to other raised hands. Soma Sundaram.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry. I try to be as short as possible. I'm from Pennsylvania, just on the other side of the river from New Jersey, Dr. Gill. In Tamil Nadu, we got away with the caste in our names. I thought in Punjab, the Singh was supposed to be a common name, but how do we still have all kind of other names, like Gill and all the other stuff? And the second thing is the Dalit community overall in Tamil Nadu have gotten much more education and employment and all that. How is that happening in Punjab? And the last question is, with this kind of a protest, finally Mamata Banerjee has asked them to step down. Is there enough voice to ask the government, the member of parliaments have the guts to push them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soma. I appreciate your questions. I'll try to also be brief. It's actually my problem that I go on and on, but the questions have been succinct. Yeah, you're right about the last name. So yeah, in Sikhi, there's a sort of injunction from Guru Gobind Singh to adopt the designations of Singh and Kaur. Remember, last names and first names are a kind of modern invention. But there's a call for Singh and Kaur to replace these caste designations. It's adopted by huge swaths of the community. Nobody forgot who they were in terms of their gotra, because one would obviously know that. But for usage, it would be X Singh, son of X Singh from this village. And then people would know their caste maybe internally. I think it's largely also the rise of the kind of modern nation state that demanded kind of identification and passports and driver's licenses, and especially coming to the West and sort of needing to kind of mark who is whom, that got a lot of people to kind of adopt these new identification methods. But it is something that people have noted, and people that are committed to that kind of practice of abolishing caste through names are making very good arguments, and I think people are sort of grappling with this issue. I think even one that adopts a Singh and Kaur, the project of abolishing caste remains. But these are meaningful gestures, and there is a kind of debate in the community about them. In terms of Dalit education in Punjab, look, largely it's pitiful. And it's pitiful because of the fact that public education has been driven into the ground by neoliberal changes, right? So the Sarkari schools in the villages, I think Meena ji asked this question as well. It's not that upper castes don't want to send their kids to the village school because there's Dalits there. It's because the education there is considered terrible and they have the funds to pay for a private school. And so the explosion of private schools, the kind of Sacred Heart, this one and that one, is that neoliberal agenda. They've done it in healthcare with the super specialty hospital, this one and that one. They've done it with education. Now they want to do it with transportation. And now they want to do it in agriculture. So Dalits, because of their poverty, are largely sort of still going to public schools, where, by the way, they teach Punjabi on the curriculum. So their Punjabi might be the best. The best poets and writers might come out of the Dalit community in Punjab because they're the most connected to the language. And then those Dalits with means, especially if they've migrated to the Gulf or further, are the ones that through remittance economies are helping their families go to private schools to get English and better quality education. To your last question, yeah, I mean, I was thinking this the other day that if the left parties are serious about opposing the BJP and supporting this protest, they should call for a general strike immediately, right? So much sort of hype was made about the December 8th strike 250 million, which is a kind of, I think, a little bit misleading, because this sort of strike happens every year and it's largely a formality. And so it kind of dovetailed with this protest and it made a big splash. But right now, the need of the hour is meaningful solidarity. And so I think that the mainstream parliamentary left parties should absolutely do this. I know a few of them have shown up at the protest site. If that means other regional parties in Tamil Nadu, in Bengal, in Maharashtra, step up and make the call, absolutely. I put less emphasis on these political parties and more on the Kisan and Mazdoor unions in these places, because there's more, I think, credibility and hope for them to take a stand. But it is welcomed. Like, there's no doubt people in Punjab have been hoping for larger solidarity across the country. And the last thing I want to quickly say is that the solidarity is not just a matter of, supporting Punjab or keeping MSP and Mandi systems in Punjab. The solidarity can actually transform into a political program that demands MSP and Mandi across the country. Kisans everywhere should get a fair price for their produce. So it's not about just having sympathy with Punjab, but if the Kisan unions in the rest of the country joined together and made this demand, we can create a different agricultural model.
Next, we have Mr. Aman Banerjee.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for your talk. It's a question about something you were just bringing up. And I wanted to, earlier in the talk, you mentioned that you saw neoliberal Hindutva and Sikhi as fundamentally incompatible. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, whether you see any danger in a version of neoliberal Hindutva that becomes compatible, or at least one in which Sikhi doesn't become a direct and overt form of resistance in the way that it is right now. And in the same way, building on the solidarity piece that you were talking about, I wanted to ask you what sort of possibilities and dangers you see in terms of building a solidarity of this Kisan-Mazdoor movement with sort of the anti-CAA movement, the anti-love jihad movement, some of the more overt forms of Hindutva as well.
Yeah, thank you, Aman. Two very good questions. The first one I think is quite confounding. If there would be a way that there could be a kind of neoliberal Hindutva project that would be compatible with Sikhi, look, my instinct is, to say no. I think it's I think impossible to reconcile, because the Hindutva operation is actually, you see this kind of irony play out. It's to deny that Sikhi is its own religion, right? The Hindutva, sort of logic is that Sikhi is actually part of Hinduism, and this kind of stranglehold, embrace, and denial of separation, right? They know what to do with Muslims, they know what to do with Christians, they're outsiders, but Sikh are part of Hinduism. Now, you see the same right-wing BJP trolls saying, kill all the Sikh, right, on social media, right? So much for being part of the Hindu fold. But Sikh have always rejected this. They have steadfastly rejected it. They've opposed it through and through. That's why the BJP has no kind of weight in Punjab. They have no sort of presence. Their leaders have kind of resigned en masse. Their alignment with the Akali Dal has collapsed. So, and it's kind of actually a point of contention. Arun Jaitley didn't win the Amritsar seat, right? The BJP kind of candidates always sort of fall flat. This Hardeep Puri also lost the Amritsar seat. So Punjabis, Sikh don't really go for the BJP, and they don't have much of a hold, because that idea of denying Sikhi its status as a religion, and the sort of bigotry, right, and the kind of arrogance of the Hindutva project will never sort of coeval with Sikh principles. Not to say that there's not like conservative right-wing Sikh, there are, and neoliberal Sikhi, or rather Sikh that support a kind of neoliberalism, there's plenty of those. They're here in America too. Now, in terms of solidarity with other struggles, yes, I think that's an important avenue to develop. I think we should understand, and you know, the AGRARIAN group, for example, that has a major presence at Tikri, were the ones that put up the signs of the Bhima Koregaon case people and the other political prisoners, people that are imprisoned for the CAA activism and other things. So they've made those gestures. It's part of their sort of outlook. Not all of the unions are on board with this, but there are these connections there. I think that, you know, people that are engaged in frontline struggle against the most authoritarian government in recent memory have a lot on their hands. And I think it is actually for people like us and others to do the work of building those connections, you know, to make those ties, make those arguments, and make those gestures of solidarity. You know, I was sort of joking, not even joking, talking with somebody else that this is, you know, one of the most important struggles happening in the world. And the American and British and Canadian left is sort of issuing half-hearted statements, but really not taking much of an active role. And I think that in terms of global solidarity, what's happening in Punjab is a frontline struggle against neoliberalism that the entire world could learn from. So I think that those ties of solidarity have to be made, and they should be done by people there, but also people elsewhere.
Right. Next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Satya Mahapatra. Mr. Satya Mahapatra.
Hi. Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, I was unmuting. Thanks, Navyug, for this great talk. I learned a lot. So my quick question is, I'll be real quick, that you did talk about that during this unity, there is a contradiction between farmers and workers, but there is a unity because of the common thread. Is there a concession the land-owning farmers are going to give, at least promise to give? I heard about the Jamin, the collective farming. Are there any talk of such concession during the struggle? Because that's the time to talk now. And even if a common utopia is achieved of like collective farming, right? But the problem of surplus is surplus workers, right? There is too many people in the agriculture that is not going away. So in a way, you need industrialization, right? So what's the vision of the KISAN-MAZDOOR in that front? Is there any articulation there?
So thank you, Satya. Excellent questions. To the first point, it's tough on this sort of explicit concessions or promises to Dalit groups. There have been people that have made statements from the stage about supporting actually what the Zameen Property Sangharsh Committee is doing, which is using the 1961 statute that stipulated Dalits ought to be given 1/3 of village shamlat lands for cultivation. And this has been kind of ignored and sort of avoided and circumvented, but it's based on that statute that this struggle has emerged. And people have been saying that, yes, absolutely, we should actually do this. The Kisan Jat spokespersons are saying we have to bring this into being in Punjab. In terms of formal promises and how far it goes, this is an open question, but they have made these kinds of statements. And the hope is that those progressive Kisan unions will be further strengthened by this struggle, will build those ties with the Dalit unions, and will be able to enact this when they get back to Punjab. It can sound like a bit of a deferral, wait till we get back, but the immediate threat of these bills is what is kind of the front line of this struggle. So you see those calls there. I don't want to exaggerate them, and I don't want to give anybody a kind of false impression. And that's why the title of the talk is Contingent. So there are lots of pitfalls, but those calls have been made. How far they go, how deep they sort of impact is still open. In terms of surplus people, look, I think part of this struggle is forcing us to reimagine economic trajectories, right? That Punjab, will never be Switzerland or California, right? And the trajectory of the Indian economy will be different from France and Britain. And because of the different histories, these are not going to be, following in that trajectory. So the narrative of, displacing people from the countryside and having them move into industrializing cities so they can work in manufacturing, that model, where is it, right? Where are these Adanis and Ambanis building, factories in Ludhiana or Patiala or Bathinda? No, they're not. Our bourgeoisie is not even the dynamic, stereotypical bourgeoisie of Europe. They are extractive and speculative, and they're not going to kind of invest and create these dynamic industries. So we have to actually reimagine what economic progress looks like. And I think we have to rethink the notion that human beings are just going to be surplus and vaddu. That burden should still be on the government to deal with its population. And if a government can't deal with its own population, maybe it shouldn't be a government.
Next, we have 3 more questions, Dr. Gill, and then we should be wrapping up. It's been over an hour. Mr. Junaid Sheikh.
Thank you. My question was about the center and region relationship, or the tensions between the center and the region, which is a theme of South Asian history. We saw that with the Mughal Empire. It tried to centralize. It split up into many regional states then, right? The British had a different model. They left so many kings in charge. The Congress tried to centralize. We got first the partition and then the rise of the regional parties. In reaction to that, we have now the BJP and the rise of Hindutva parties. So do you see this agitation now as the first step in the reassertion of the region? Or do you think that centralization still has more legs and can scupper the emergence of regionalization again?
Thank you, Junaid. Excellent question. I could play that old trick on you and say, what a wonderful question. Could you answer it, please? Yeah, I think actually, this is something I actually wrote about in an op-ed piece in December in Al Jazeera. And what I said there is that the fundamental problem we have is a kind of neoliberal democracy. It is a kind of tyranny of numbers. Whatever else the BJP's arguments are, at the end of the day, they say we won 303 seats in the Lok Sabha, and we have the authority to do whatever we want. And you, Punjab, with your 13 seats will never matter. And Haryana's 10 seats will never matter, right? Now, this is together 53 million people in Punjab and Haryana, right? That's more than the population of Spain and Colombia and South Korea. And they're being told that their future, their economy, their livelihood will never sort of be under their own control because they're in a collectivity with states that have more people. So is democracy just a rule of numbers? Is it just whoever has the most wins the day? That's why I said, here that as a proportion of the population, Sikh are 2% of 2% of India, 1.5% of the territory, and this same 2% and 1.5% of the territory made 70% of the wheat. So what is proportion then? And I agree that this is going to lead people to raise questions about the nature of democracy. And I would say that it's not just for the sort of radical voices to challenge this centralizing of authority. It is these liberals that believe in the Constitution, liberals that believe in the idea of India, who are seeing it being undermined. They must actually do something besides clutching at their pearls and having these hoke, if they actually want to preserve the country. Because the kinds of tendencies that the BJP is putting forward, as you rightly point out, inherited and carried on from the Congress, are what is going to destroy this country.
Next, we have Daljit Dhami. Daljit, are you there?
Hi, sorry. So thank you so much for sharing your depth of knowledge. It's always a treat. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the alternative proposals, and if there are any organizations, entities, or individuals that have proposed that alternative model of cooperative land ownership that does bring about caste unity and also reparations, if I may be so radical, or something that kind of repairs the damage from the Green Revolution, given that, you know, the estimates are that 15 to 20 years, Punjab's going to be a desert. And forgive me, I don't know too much about the agrarian issues in other states, but yeah, that's the majority of my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diljit. It's good you're putting those issues on the table. And I think either Soma or somebody else might have said this, and I might have overlooked it, or part of Satya actually's question. There are alternative proposals. That is, I think, one of the most sort of infuriating things about how these economists, these Darbari economists, have talked about this issue. They say that these are agricultural reforms and that we needed to do something. You know, the agriculture is stagnating. There's extra people. The water table is sinking. So they kind of pay lip service to all of the problems and sort of make the plea that reforms are needed. These are not reforms. These are not going to address any of the problems in agriculture. They are nothing but a corporate handover. Secondly, people have been demanding reforms for 5 decades. Right from the onset of the so-called Green Revolution, doubts were raised by environmentalists, by social activists, by political parties, by civil society operatives, by again, rural economists, even at that time, saying that this model is going to lead to disaster. And they were all sort of ignored and maligned and rejected. So there's actually lots of proposals on the table. We don't actually have to kind of come up with something new. You know, I wrote somewhere else that, you know, EPW comes out with a review of agriculture like every year. And there's, you know, half dozen articles on Punjab's agriculture that are, you know, done by very serious scholars doing the patient work of tracking these trends and marking, you know, water supply and fertilizer use and output levels, and the fact that wheat and rice output has kind of leveled off and even gone down, and the share in the sort of national pool is dropped. The question is actually a political struggle to bring those alternatives to the fore. That's our challenge, because I know people that have adopted organic farming. I know people that have engaged in small-scale cultivation. I know people that have rejected paddy, because rice is an alien crop to Punjab. It's a kind of disaster. The people that have done that I know, have 25 acres. And so they can afford to engage in these kinds of alternatives. And if they don't turn out well, they can manage the losses and ride it over for the next term. The point is that for the vast majority of cultivators who are small and marginal, they can't afford those kinds of you know, gestures or you know, one-off alternatives. They would require state infrastructure. And so I think the political struggle after the repeal of these bills is to demand an alternative set of crops that get MSP, the funding and bonuses and support to get people to grow them, and transforming the model from there. Because otherwise you'd get sort of independent initiatives which can only be done by the privileged. On the other hand, what Meena was saying is the grassroots option of people coming together and sort of fighting and figuring out their own way. It won't be as widespread, but people can take that initiative, and it is actually happening. But I think the question becomes one of scale. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gill, again for patiently answering all of those questions in depth as well with critical analysis. Last question of the day, we have Anshu Malhotra.
So being the last one to ask these questions, I think a majority of things that I wanted to ask have already been put on the table, but I'll just, you know, voice these once again. And the conversation that has been going on. So I think it's really been important, Navyug, after your really wonderful and very brief but very coherently, placed arguments. So I really appreciate Meena Dhanda bringing up the question of ritual hierarchies in Punjab. I think it's something that we do need to keep in mind. They may be very different from the rest of India, but they do exist, caste hierarchies. And I think sometimes we forget virtually the epistemological change that has occurred in 1947 in what Punjab is, right? So just wanted to put that on the table. The other question that Daljit brought in about, crop diversification and what is happening to the environment because of Green Revolution, and what, the Kisan unions are thinking about diversification of crop, which is clearly, something that they need to take on board. But I think you've already answered that in a very cogent way, so I will not persist on that. Third thing that I wanted to actually put on the table was the participation of Haryana and Western UP in the struggle as well. And quite clearly, you have the more elite sections of the Jats who are participating from there. So has it, in a sense, become a Jat issue, the way in which the struggle is moving forward? And finally, you had, in the beginning of your talk, said that you have some thoughts on what happened on 26th January at Red Fort. I would like you to share those thoughts of, putting the Nishan Sahib there and, in a sense, trying to both recreate a historical moment, through the placing of the flag there, but also what you seem to have hinted at, that the way in which this very nefarious and arrogant government has chosen to, how it manipulates things and how it infiltrates, if I might use that word, to discredit movements that have a huge groundswell support at this point of time. So just your thoughts on that. Thank you, Navyug, for that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Anshu. Great to hear from you. So, yeah, to your points, I think I on the first point again with Meena, I agree. I think so. It's not at all about a lack of hierarchy and lack of caste hierarchy. I was trying to sort of convey the difference of its basis. And the thing I was thinking about is this song by Santaram Udasi called the Jatate Sidi the Hal. And in that song, he invokes the kind of shared plight of the Jat and the Sidi, and it's a sort of Jat and a Mazbi, and who jointly cultivate a parcel of land, but the Jat owns it and pays the Sidi sort of a kind of wage. But it's a very fraught song because they talk about the song. Santaram Udasi talks about kind of the shared anguish, the how they can commiserate. The Jat can commiserate with the Sidi. There's a kind of friendship, and there's a kind of lament at the sort of overall kind of misery that they're facing. The fact that they can kind of take food to the fields together and eat as they do this work. So some of those things are very hard to understand in the kind of conventional Hindu hierarchy of absolute distance and space and hostility and fastidiousness about touch and sight. Not to say there aren't separate utensils, not to say that there isn't this kind of bigotry, there isn't this kind of discrimination, but I'm trying to flesh out some of the differences in the texture. And maybe there's some imprecise language and one should emphasize things more carefully. And there's different kinds of studies that people have done and different experiences. So I appreciate bringing that up and one needing to kind of learn from that. So your second point about the role of the Haryanvis and the UP and the Jats. Yeah, I think I know relatively less about the other groups in Haryana that have come out in support, because usually you get to hear about the Jats and I guess they're taking sort of pictures of the kind of imagery, and Ticket in UP has kind of made a big show in the last day about his position. So I need to learn more actually about other groups. What are Dalits in Haryana saying and doing? What are Dalits in Western UP or even Rajasthan? I know more about the situation in Punjab, so maybe that is something to kind of follow up on. Now, the issue about the Red Fort, look, there is so much to say, and then there's so much uncertainty. And so my first sort of instinct, and I'm very grateful that I don't watch Indian TV, so and all I see is what's on social media, and it's exhausting and sort of repulsive as to, like I said, people fixating on this one thing and like demanding explanations. I mean, if I show you my inbox about how many good dear friends of mine have said, was that the Khalistan flag? And I don't even know where to begin with explaining it, right? For people that are not specialists of Punjab or whatever, unaware. So I think, there's a role of infiltrators and enablers of the BJP. But my sort of, my approach to this is I don't need to spend time proving or disproving conspiracy. Because the moment you accuse somebody of a BJP being an agent, you then have to say how many crore rupees were put in somebody's bank account, how many pictures were taken with them here or there, phone records, right? Everything that happens in Pakistan is a raw agent. Everything happening in India is an ISI agent. The 9/11 was some other agent. So I dispense with the conspiracy theory agent, and I instead see recklessness, adventurism, irresponsibility. And people can pursue those things without any concern because they're not actually bound to an organization that has a duty to its people. On top of that, there are people with sentiment. This was an incredibly symbolic act. There were people that were frustrated for sitting on Tarna for 2 months and wanted to do something more. Those are people that are part of a community. They're not all paid agents. They do exist. And I think we have to find a way to deal with our own people rather than succumb to this kind of liberal, let's denounce them or support FIRs. And if the unions are saying this, I understand their frustration too, because they had to kind of see the real danger to their movement, the potential collapse of it, the loss of support. And so they're very angry and they've made those charges and denounced people. But I think as somebody kind of in the diaspora, I don't need to engage in that, least of all to get sort of mainstream Indians comfortable, but also to kind of refocus and refract the issue. And at the end of the day, I mean, maybe the last thing is, so what if they put a flag up? You guys, people that are getting anxious over a flag, do they not see the outrages and atrocities that are committed on a daily basis that they won't pay any mind to? So I'm not avoiding the question. I try to kind of think carefully about myself and what are the things that I want to, what is my duty to respond to? But again, this is one of the things where I really want to hear your perspective too. I'd want to hear other people how to understand this. But that's what it is now. And maybe the last absolute thing is that I think there's more accounts coming and we're hearing different things. And I think more will be unraveled. And then one might be in a better position to actually make harder statements. Right now, there is uncertainty. And I don't want to do too much speculation. I've probably done too much already.
All right, on that note, it looks like that we are almost closing in at this point. We want to thank Dr. Navyug Gill for his time and expertise and sharing all the thoughts about this crisis and all the knowledge that he shared. And thank you so much for all the audience for asking some really critical questions. And again, kudos to him for answering it also as effectively. With that said, if there's no more remarks, I'd like to call this thing a closure. We do have another series coming up on February 11th. That would be again at the same time, 9 p.m. PST, 8 Central, and 9 EST. You can follow the work at akscusa.org. There's a list of all the webinars that are being scheduled in the next week or so, in the next month as well. So with that said, you guys have a great night. Wish you good night. And thank you again, Dr. Gill, for your time. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you all. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim. Jai Bhim. Thank you.